Well, a little Sunday evening story. This one goes back several decades. I call it August 1987 of a cornfield in the Midwest and Air Mid Worst. One summer I enrolled in an International Development Certificate program at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. After completing the month-long course, I caught an Air Midwest flight back to Atlanta via Chicago. There were no direct flights. Air Midwest was a regional Delta carrier and flew mostly twin-engine turboprop Embraer planes. I was the only passenger as we departed for our first leg to Chicago, and I went to the back of the plane where there were 3 seats together and lay across them. I fell asleep before we even started to taxi. The flight gate to gate was usually less than an hour. A sense something was not quite right awakened me, and I looked at my watch and realized we'd only been in the air for less than 20 minutes. Out the window, I saw we were descending very rapidly into a sea of green cornfields as far as the eye could see. No sign of an airport anywhere. The pilot came on the intercom and said, "Buckle your seatbelts and tuck your head between your knees. We're making an emergency landing." I tried to comply, but I was so nervous my head kept bobbing up and down and around like a jack-in-the-box. Suddenly we bounced hard. I popped my head up to see the wings clipping the corn as we sped by at a high rate of speed. The pilot braked. I was pitched forward as the screaming brakes finally brought us to an abrupt stop in a cloud of dust and shattered corn stalks. Looking back out, I could see a pole with a night watchman light and a rotary telephone on it. I realized we had landed in some farmer's poorly maintained private asphalt airstrip. The corn was planted right up to the edge of the tarmac and no road was visible. Everything was suddenly quiet as the engines came to a full stop. After several minutes of silence, the co-pilot pulled the curtain and partitioned off the cockpit off to one side, and the plane had a small emergency ladder, and he dropped it to the ground. He picked up the handset and made a call. He engaged in a highly animated conversation, and after a few minutes returned to the cockpit and drew the curtain closed. No one had said a word to me. I kept waiting, soaking wet from a combination of adrenaline and heat, and after several minutes passed, I made my way to the front, gingerly moved the curtain around and peeked into the cockpit. The pilot and co-pilot were clearly asleep, a small battery fan oscillating between them. I cleared my throat. No reaction. Finally I said, "Excuse me, what's going on?" The co-pilot barely cracked his eyes and said, "Broke down. I called a mechanic out of Chicago. He should be here within the hour." He closed his eyes again. I thought, what the hell? My voice slightly elevated, annoyed by his lack of attention and responsiveness. I said, "It's hot as hell back here. Is it okay if I get off?" With a somewhat vexed sigh, he said, "Suit yourself," never opening his eyes. I climbed down the ladder, looked around, nothing but corn in the sweltering August afternoon heat and unbearable humidity, not the slightest hint of a breeze in sight. I realized the only shade was under the wing. I climbed back up the ladder and retrieved my hard leather briefcase, and I placed it under the wing and used it for a seat. After some period of time, I heard the put-put-put of a small engine. Looking up, I saw a single-engine Piper Club slowly drifting down to the runway. It landed and leisurely taxied up to park behind our plane. The pilot got out wearing greasy gray overalls and pulled a large toolbox from behind the seat. He sat the box on the tarmac and went into the plane without saying a word. In a few minutes he came back out, picked up the toolbox, and walked over to the wing I was under. Still silent, he gave a slight nod and then opened the engine cowl and started to work. A little over half an hour passed, and he closed the cowl, put his tools away, and went back in with the pilots. Shortly he returned to his plane and put, took off, flying slowly out of sight. I sat there in silence for a good while, and no one told me anything. Finally I climbed the ladder, looked in the cockpit. There were both pilots, knocked out again. Shook the co-pilot's shoulder. He slowly opened his eyes, and I turned my palms up in an inquisitive shrug. And as he closed his eyes again, the only thing he said was, Wrong part. I shook my head mystified and returned to my improvised perch under the wing. Something over an hour and a half passed when I heard the sound of the returning Piper Cub. This time the mechanic went straight to the engine, saying nothing. He dropped the cow and went to work in less than 15 minutes, buttoned it back up. Packing up his tools, he rapped on the fuselage a couple of times with his closed fist. The pilot looked down and the mechanic gave him a thumbs up. As the mechanic flew off, the co-pilot came to the door and gestured for me to get back on the plane. He watched as I returned to the back seats, and we took with him and never saying a word. In fact, the pilot had never even acknowledged my existence. We were on the ground for a little more than 5 hours, and by the time I got to O'Hare, I'd missed my flight to Atlanta, and no more were available. I found a room at the airport and collapsed without eating. I was exhausted and angry. Delta had not even offered me a voucher. When I got back to Atlanta, I filed a claim. Unfortunately, in a matter of weeks, Air Mid West bellied up in bankruptcy. I then filed a complaint with Delta, but they took the position they had no liability and refused to pay. So I never received any compensation. Now, for the rest of the story, page 2. About 6 months later, I booked a Delta Connection flight. As I got on the Embraer regional plane, I had an odd deja vu experience. I went to the back of the plane where I usually sat. I noticed that the rear seat pocket in front of me was torn like the one on the earlier trip. I opened the pocket, took out the safety card. Lo and behold, it was logoed Air Mid West. It was the exact same plane, different crew. When we landed, I asked the pilot how long he'd been flying this plane. He answered, just a few months. Delta had acquired all the Air Mid West equipment in the bankruptcy. I stood there speechless, shook my head, and departed the plane. I'm sure he thought I was a bit off. Thank you.